David Abla, welcome.
Jason.
Hi, Jason.
Great. We're going to give it just a couple of minutes for people to join and trickle in. In the meantime, why doesn't everybody in the chat over on the right-hand side of the panel drop in where you guys are from? I'd love to see where the audience is from. We typically have people from all over the world. It's always interesting to see. In the meantime, David, Abla, you guys have anything fun planned for the holidays coming up or anything?
Well, it's from my side of the house, the holidays fall at our fiscal year end. So we are going to be focused on booking deals and closing out the year, which is oddly enough very exciting for me. So that is my plan.
That's the downside to having the calendar year as your fiscal year, hey? New Year's Eve.
Exactly.
Super fun. Yeah, Jason, we're doing a bit of an early Christmas this year. We're going out to New York for the Salesforce World Tour, but then hopping over to Toronto to see some family ahead of time. And then for Christmas, I'll actually be home in Vancouver here.
Very cool. I think we had talked about it before. I used to sponsor every domestic Salesforce event when I was at my first SaaS company. So I know that game well.
Yeah, I hear you. We were similar. Yeah, I've been to Atlanta, Dallas, Toronto, Chicago, LA, you name it. Yeah, it's always lots of fun.
In fact, I'm pretty sure I did some partnership stuff with you guys way back in the day whenever I was at Cirrus.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it goes back a ways.
Yeah, talk about starting to show and feel your age whenever you start going back that far.
Some
cool.
May have to be updated.
All right, we've got all kinds of people from Canada, Boston. Well, cool. Should we go ahead and kick this off then?
Sounds good.
Let's do that. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm Jason Hubbard. I am COO here at RevGenius. And we're here to discuss how to speed up territory reassignment. So I've got David and Abla here. Let's go around the horn really quickly. Let you guys introduce yourselves.
Sure.
David, you want to start us?
Yeah, I'll be happy to go first. I first want to apologize to the audience for not having my camera on. Ran into some connectivity issues at the last minute, so you get to look at my picture, which is fine, hopefully okay. Hi everyone, I'm Abla Feliciano. I'm a director of revenue operations at Alteryx. Alteryx is a self-serve data and analytics platform. I've been with the company for a little over 7 years. And when I started, it was just a team of 2 in sales operations. And I currently lead a team of 22 people focused on go-to-market systems and support, and love every minute of it. It's a great place to work, and territory reassignments are near and dear to my heart.
Awesome. David?
Yeah, hey Jason. Thanks for having me. And thanks for putting together this community. It's amazing. We've been the recipients of a ton of great content and material. And yeah, hopefully today we can give something back. So my name is David Nelson. I'm the CEO of Traction Complete. And we believe that data can be this incredible instruction set for businesses if it's done properly. So we've been on this mission for the last several years to try and improve the lives of revenue folks by creating software that helps automate a lot of the data management tasks in Salesforce, cleaning up duplicates, normalizing data, linking accounts and hierarchies, assigning records out, and now expanding into lots more areas. So yeah, looking forward to this conversation. A ton of our customers work with us on a regular basis for territory. So yeah, hopefully I get to learn a lot today.
Great. As we were talking about, end of year holiday plans, stuff like that, this of course is prime time for planning going into the new year. And of course, territory assignment as well as business plans and stuff like that will drive a lot of the stuff. This is the time for really diving into and focusing on that. So I think the timing of this topic is extremely timely for most of us out there that are doing this. where do you typically start whenever you're beginning this process, Abla, as far as going down and figuring out the stuff before you actually go into territory assignment? Because of course there's a lot that needs to go into that as a precursor for it.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the first place to start is really having clarity and alignment within your operations team around what the go-to-market strategy is going to be for the upcoming year. For us, those conversations typically start in the summer, so that we have Q3 and Q4 to have really clear kind of marching orders around what our strategy is going to be for the following year. So things like, what are the markets that we really want to focus on? Are there any specific industries that are really important to us as a company that we want to go tackle? What are the teams in terms of segmentation going to look like? Do we have a strategic, an enterprise, SMB, which is how we're set up at Alteryx? How big are those teams going to be? Where are we going to make investments? So having clarity around what that structure and what that strategy is going to be is, I think, the place to start first. That way everyone knows what we're driving towards, and then we can go build territories to support that strategy. So for me, that's always the first place to begin the journey.
Awesome. David, how about you?
Oh yeah, sorry, before I'll just ask Abba a question. So Abba, does the RevOps team tend to get involved in those kind of like higher level decisions when you're earlier deciding new markets to go after, or how many more reps you're bringing on this year?
Yeah, absolutely, we do. It is something that I would say we facilitate. This year, for example, our RevOps team led a series of kind of workshops, I would call them globally, with each of our international theaters to really deep dive into what the strategy is going to look like, and then also use data to decide, make decisions around which geographies are really, really important for us to focus on. So RevOps is definitely the center of those conversations, and really more than anything helps facilitate those conversations in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I believe it. Yeah, and sorry, Jason, you asked me. Same thing, exactly. We tend to start at that high level. Which markets are we tackling? Are we creating new segments? How many new reps are we bringing in, or territories are we going to need? And not just the account executives, but it might be business development reps or pre-sales as well, because that, I think, impacts it all. And that seems to be where we start before we actually go into the carving of territories. I think it's a little bit of chicken and egg, I would say, right? That you're trying to use the data that you have to make those decisions, but at the same time, there's also kind of this strategic plan that you want to tackle something new that you might not have data on yet as well. So sometimes you can use that.
As somebody that's gotten out over our skis more times than I would care to admit, whereas like you didn't take this initial step to like really think through or work through your planning implications, things like hiring or shifts that you're planning on doing, stuff like that. You really don't want to have to get that far down the road and then be like, oh, we didn't think of that, or we didn't take that into account. Now you got to go and really retool and rethink everything. And, so a lot of times you may be itching to get into this, but holy crap, is it worth it to take that time, pause, and make sure you've got the stuff as sorted out as possible before you actually go and start doing any of these things or implementing anything. But speaking of things that are really kind of critical here before you actually go and start pushing any of this out, or even sharing within the broader team or organization, what are some other things that you can do to set yourself up for success relative to this?
Yeah, so I think once you have clarity around what the strategy is going to be, then it kind of shifts into a very, very large data exercise, and making sure that you have the appropriate and adequate amount of data in order for you to build territories in a way that's really successful, I think is like the immediate next step. So, for example, if your strategy is to penetrate the G2K, which is something that we at Alteryx care a lot about, that to us is a very important list of accounts that we want to make sure we're taking care of, or customers that we want to go get. Do we have anything in Salesforce or CRM that indicates that these are G2K accounts, right? So what about annual revenue? Do you have up-to-date annual revenue information? hierarchy information. So do we know parent-child relationships between all of the different accounts in Salesforce? So those are the types of things that you need to make sure are shored up and in really good shape before you even begin cutting the territories. You need to have the data in a really good place, up to date, kind of refreshed with the newest information, so that you can then go start to slice it into smaller chunks.
What are, I know one thing that's a precursor to a lot of that for organizations are making sure that that you know what you're looking for in the data, that you have those things prioritized, or that those filters, criteria, whatever, that you're using to divvy things up or even considering it. Are there things that you guys recommend relative to that to be able to go and say, because it's a two-part process. You have to work with what you have, you have to clean it up, and you also have to work towards what your ideal is, whether you've got the data necessarily around it or it's in good shape or not. Do you guys have tips around how to kind of manage that sort of back and forth process to get to sort of the best that you can get to?
Abba, you want to take that one?
Oh gosh. Yeah, I mean, I think for us, it all comes down to kind of having as up-to-date data as possible. And so things that for us at Alteryx that are really, really important is firmographic information, right? So we take a lot of time going into the new year to make sure that the firmographic information that we're going to look at from a customer base is really up to date. So we'll work with partners like Traction Complete to make sure that our hierarchy data is super, super clean. We feel really, really good about it. It's all about just kind of making sure that things are refreshed in a timely manner so that it's as most up to date as possible before you begin the data exercise of cutting it up into smaller pieces, I suppose. I don't know, Dave, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I totally agree. I think for every business, there's no one size fits all, but everyone still wants that clean data. They want to have the firmographics because most companies are carving territories based on firmographics. Not everyone, but usually they want to know either annual revenue, number of employees, address for sure, industry. Those can all impact the decisions on who's going to receive these accounts and opportunities and whatnot. And so you'll want to pick a data provider, and sometimes it's many, right? So when you're a big company that's dealing global, usually you're going to need someone specific for Japan or Asia or whatnot that isn't necessarily the same data provider you're using for the core in North America. And so you'll want to go through that exercise to enrich it. And then there's other practices as well, because throughout the year, last year you would have done the same thing, but throughout the year, companies have grown or shrunk, right? This year, unfortunately, a lot of companies have shrunk, so they might have gone into a different segment. But also there's been mergers and divestitures and whatnot. And so that changes where these companies should lay. And so again, it's not one size fits all, but you want to have a policy around that, because you want to decide, hey, are we drawing a line in the sand on January 1st, if that's your fiscal year, or February 1st, if you're on the Salesforce year, that the firmographics at that point is what we're using for our rule? Or is it going to be fluid throughout the year, so that if there is a merger and it makes sense to bring that into a new account, that you can update that and have the sales reps run with it? So those are the kind of decisions you need to make. But I'll pass it over to Abba, because she's the expert in those kind of policies and decisions that you want to try and do.
Yeah, that's a good point, though, about kind of like, do we lock it down or do we let it kind of run throughout the year? In my experience, and this is just kind of what I've seen work well, I would recommend to lock it down and just kind of draw a line in the sand and say, as of Jan 1, this is the data that we're using. So, for example, annual revenue is really important, a firmographic data point that we use when we're cutting territories. And when I first started at Alteryx, we just kind of let it continuously update. It would just, as things changed, it would update. And what it ended up creating was a lot of friction in the field, because one day an account could be classified as SMB, and then something happened and they had a really great quarter, and now it's an enterprise account. And now you've got reps fighting with each other over something changing. And then next quarter it could drop down below SMB. And so I would say locking it down, kind of taking that snapshot at the beginning of the year. These are the data points that we used on Jan 1 to create our territories, and just kind of limiting that is a good best practice in terms of reducing friction. It's going to help prevent a lot of heartache. Everyone will just feel like, okay, my territory is my territory. If something were to change, we have a policy to address that, but it's mine. I can feel secure in my territory, and it just removes any uncertainty, and it allows them to just kind of hit the ground running and not have to become, oddly enough, very territorial, that someone's going to take something away from me, which is, I think, a very common fear that a lot of sales reps experience and have play out in their lives. So I try to do everything I can to minimize that type of experience or feeling. And so I think locking it down is a good best practice to adhere to.
Yeah, sales reps don't tend to be that easygoing.
No.
Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah.
No,
South
go ahead,
actually,
David.
yeah, so they do that. They lock it down at the beginning of the year. Throughout the year, they'll make changes, but they're making the changes for next year's data, and they don't send it live until February 1st for them. But they'll make those that rule, that line in the sand to say, yeah, we know you can go Google and you're going to find different answers, but we lock this down. This is what we're using as a rule. And then it's not necessarily fair because that's different for every person, but that at least it's consistent, and then it's understandable and everyone can work through it.
Yeah, and things like mergers and acquisitions, I do recommend that as another best practice, is to have a policy around how to handle those types of mid-year changes, right? So at Alteryx, we do have a mergers and acquisitions policy that very clearly lays out to our sales teams, if company A were to acquire company B, this is how you are going to engage together, and we're going to do some opportunity splits if appropriate. But it's very clear and very, transparent around how it needs to work if that situation were to come up. And it really, again, it's all about reducing friction so that reps aren't spending time fighting or feeling anxiety around the accounts that they may or may not own, depending on the month within the year. They can just feel really confident and just go sell, which is really what we want them to do.
Absolutely.
It's funny. I joke often. The number one thing that got me ready or prepared as you can be to be a parent was all the years I spent rep wrangling. And dealing with things like, confrontation around fairness and who owns what and who's doing what and all of these things you guys are talking about. And so, if you can have rules of engagement around things where you can point to and say, like, okay, fair or not, we all know the rules and we're playing by the rules, that goes so far into trying to manage these things.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, totally agree.
So at this point, we've gone through, we've formalized as best as possible the plans going into the new year as far as, targets, new shifts in, who your ICP or personas might be, hiring plans, organizational plans, stuff like that. So that stuff's as dialed in as can be. We've looked at the data side of it, making sure that that's as clean, that you've got as much of the data that you need and be able to effectively sift and sort through. Now you've got to try and start figuring out how are we actually going to divvy this up. And so, back to that fairness thing, while it may not always be fair, you want to try and get it as fair as possible, within this. So to me, this is one of the more art side of things than maybe the science of cleaning up the data and making sure that all of that's together. How do you do this balancing act? How do you try and get this as fair as you possibly can?
Yeah, no, this is really where like the rubber meets the road when it comes to the carving territories and reassigning accounts. And I agree with you. I think our goal when we're doing this type of work is to create as equitable territories as we possibly can so that every rep has as fair a shot as possible to hit their number. So what that looks like from our experience or my experience is really understanding the potential. So that's a key data point that we pay a lot of attention to. Historically, we've used different ways of calculating what does potential look like, what does TAM look like. I see Matt posed a question about enrichment tools. In the past, we've used the Bureau of Employment Statistics to help us understand how many data workers, which is something we care a lot about at Alteryx as a data and analytics platform. How many data workers does a company have? How many seats have we already sold of like Alteryx to a specific company? So really we can calculate very quickly the runway. How much potential can I get out of this account in the coming year? And so for us, then it becomes an exercise of calculating potential or TAM across the bag of accounts that we're assigning to all of the different reps. And we've used different ratios in the past. We typically stick to like a 3x, like you have 3 times the amount of potential in your territory against what we anticipate your quota is going to be. So there's plenty of coverage in your accounts to hopefully hit your number. And then that really is I would say the science, because it's a data exercise. And then the art comes in where we partner very, very closely with our sales leaders at this point to be like, these are the territories. We've tried to balance it as much as possible. What do we need to change? Let's fine tune, let's refine, but let's never lose sight of that potential that each territory holds, so that we're never giving out a territory to someone with maybe 1.5 times potential to hit their quota and someone has 8 times as much potential to hit their quota. That's totally unbalanced. So that is kind of the game or the dance that we play around. Like, let's look at what the art of the possible is and make sure that everyone has as fair a shot as possible, but let's also do what makes sense from the business. And that's where the partnership, the close partnership with the sales leadership comes in to kind of refine and fine tune and kind of move things around in a way that is maybe more relationship based and makes more sense for the business.
So
I've got to go ahead, David.
Yeah, when you're doing that, you mentioned that you like to have your territories that have 3 times more potential than what the quota is. How do you determine that? So you're using the Bureau of Statistics, but how do you determine that there's 3 times more potential in that territory?
I mean, that for us, like data workers is a really key number. Like, how many Alteryx users could we possibly sell to? But we also need to know what our existing footprint is. If I've maxed out my potential at an account, right? We could have an account with, just potential off the charts, but if we've already sold a very, very large contract that's an unlimited ELA and there's nothing left to sell, well, that account, as big as it is, needs to be treated differently and not considered one of those accounts where there's lots of runway and lots left to sell. That's more, that's a renewal kind of conversation or kind of a play that we'll be running with that territory. So that for us is really, really the primary factor is how many Alteryx users do we see in account that we can continue to grow with. And this becomes really important too for segmentation because, our strategic accounts for us are very, very large customers already. And maybe those accounts that have lots of potential, they're very, very big, lots of data workers, but maybe we haven't quite gotten to like a critical mass yet. We would bump those down to like an enterprise segment and maybe let some more of those hunter type sales reps get in those accounts to build momentum and try and build up the install base as much as possible. So understanding kind of the pool of available users, where we've already sold and what's left to go is really, really important for us to decide where an account sits.
Yeah, I think, David, I think you really cut to the heart of it. And it's that potentiality question that is, I think, the art to it as much as anything, which is because there's all kinds of ways to try and get to that potential. Abla, you were talking about, the number of seats, number of potential users being, one of the big drivers on your guys' side, because that's going to vary radically from company to company, oftentimes even product to product. I imagine that you're for the most part to get at least some sort of foundation or starting point, if not most of the way there. You're looking at sort of first party internal historical data to drive that. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, that is accurate for sure.
Yep. And so we had one question that's kind of along similar lines there from Jeff. He was asking, you're calculating 3x territory potential based off of TAM. Does that entail that you're having to go into each one of these territories and really carefully examine what that TAM is? How do you balance that, manual deep dive, granular process versus being able to actually get through all of this and get it out the door?
Yeah, this is where the partnership with the sales leaders really comes into play, because you're right. It's been my experience that most operations teams are wildly understaffed for the number of salespeople that they serve. I think that's true for most companies. And so you need to find a scalable way to do this work. So relying and partnering very closely with the first line managers is where I would kind of go to help do that. And I do think it's important to make sure that each territory is kind of inspected carefully and everyone feels good about it. It serves a couple of purposes. Again, we want to make sure that the territories are as fair as we possibly can make them. So that's part one. But part two is if you have the sales leaders kind of partnering with you in refining and making sure that each territory is fair. Once they go live, having those sales leaders on your side to help justify the territories, because inevitably people will be upset about an account or something. Having the sales leaders participate in that work around territory reassignments is going to help quiet a lot of that noise and takes a lot of the heat off of the operations teams to just be the bad guys giving out that territories. It really is a partnership. They can go to their first line managers and have that person help explain why a territory is built a certain way. And it's not just, mean operations people doing data exercise with no context, right? So it kind of serves two purposes. But in terms of the scalability, yeah, you need help. And this is for sure where I would look to sales to help me do that inspection.
What are some?
I'll add just a little to that, Jason. So yeah, I totally agree. When you have a lot of data, it's insurmountable to go through manually every single record. So I think what Avlo was suggesting was fantastic. She has that external data provider that helps give them that they can automatically enrich the accounts with. In their case, it was number of data workers kind of thing. In other cases, I know that some SIs and other companies that sell through Salesforce, they use the Salesforce AEs as their alignment. Others use first-party data, like Jason said, and third-party data to say, hey, we know of this amount of accounts, but that there's a whole world out there that doesn't exist. And usually those are the smaller companies, right? When they haven't got to a maturity level where their entire TAM is in their database. So they can use both. You want to automate as much as you can, enrich the records with whatever matters to you. Usually it's your ICP, your firmographics, industry, number of employees, revenue, that sort of thing. And then create your own secret sauce for scoring. Avla's case, it was 3x of how many data workers there are in that account across all the accounts that are in that territory. Others, it will be, number of employees for the tech industry for all of the accounts that fit into your region. Or maybe you start with all of the accounts that fit into cities or states. Get that sense and then break it down from there. But try and automate it, because you're right, you just can't get through manually for all of them.
Yep, great. I think you actually either had already read or just anticipated Adam's question there about other metrics and considerations for building cool territories. So, short answer there, it depends. You try and find what your best indicators are out of that. And I think the other piece to it is obviously you keep testing these things. And so, at the end of the year, one of the big things for me is going back and seeing how well did we do based off of what our criteria were for this on actually balancing this, and how effective was that with people actually being able to achieve those metrics or those things that we had set out for them. So it needs to be an iterative process, and you always keep refining this. Cool. So, we've got the data, we've gone through and we've actually done the scoring. We've figured out, broadly and gotten some initial alignment with, leadership on, does this look and feel right? How do you actually start getting this out there and rolling this out to the team? Because, like we alluded to with, this being a great lesson in how to parent, this can be a gargantuan task, getting alignment behind this. And, And you really need to get everybody pointed in the right direction and marching in order with this. And so this is an absolutely critical stage to it. So Abla, do you have suggestions of kind of where you start with that, or some of the best practices you've developed over the years?
Yeah, absolutely. I think with all things, communication is key. So I would definitely say that building in a communication plan around what the new territory model is going to look like for an upcoming year, and putting some enablement and thought around how you want to share that with the sales teams is really, really valuable and time well spent. It just kind of quiets a lot of the noise. I think just like any other human, when you don't know, you kind of assume the worst. And so it's just better to just be transparent and open with like, this is how we've done our work. This is how it's going to work. And then hand in hand with that is to really just develop those policies and rules of engagement to make sure everyone understands what the rules of the road are going to be for the upcoming year. So, what happens if it's the new year and I am going to lose an account to another rep, but I was already working a deal? What does that opportunity holdover policy look like? I think having that really well-defined and communicated, again, quiets a lot of the noise and people know exactly what they're going to be dealing with. Mergers and acquisitions that happen in the middle of the year. What do we do with that? How do we want to handle those situations? So taking time to have a policy around that takes all of the guesswork and removes a lot of the anxiety from the sales teams around what that's going to look like. So it's doing that upfront work around communication and then sharing all of that information ahead of the actual cutover, I think is really, really valuable. Additionally, I think another one that's really, really important is, we're talking a lot about territory reassignments at the beginning of the year, but we know that there are lots of headcount changes that take place in the middle of the year. People get promoted, they leave companies, they do different roles. What does that policy look like? What are you going to do when you have an open territory? Do you give everything to a manager? Do you maybe temporarily reassign things out to the remaining team members? Having clarity around that and having that very clearly communicated to the sellers at the beginning of the year, again, is going to be really helpful to quiet the noise, to reduce the anxiety, and just make sure everyone doesn't waste time thinking about those what ifs. They can just know what's going to happen and then go sell.
Yep.
Yeah, I totally agree. Matt Wester at Capato talks about the same thing, having reps basically sign those policies beginning of the year before they get their territories, making sure that everyone's kind of bought into the rules, so that then when they roll out the territories, they can say, hey, you guys are on board with this, you sign on, you recognize that there's going to be discrepancies, but that this is how we're going to handle them. And it helps kind of temper those emotions.
Well, so from an operational standpoint, from a technology and data standpoint, we've gotten this far down. We've got it all mapped out. We've tried to drive alignment. We've got rules of engagement, all of these pieces of it. Now we've actually got to go do the work of assigning these things. As somebody that's played this game more than I would like, you obviously, or maybe not obviously, and David, you can probably speak to this as to why, you don't want to have this to be a never-ending data loader project that you're doing. So there's better, more elegant ways to do this for a whole variety of reasons. But before we go into how you avoid doing that, David, you want to talk really briefly about why you don't want to go the other direction?
Yeah, absolutely. No, and you're totally right, Jason. So I think most people would then go, once you've carved your territories and you have it in your spreadsheet or in your data system, your planning tool, that you would just jump to a data load, right? And that you would assign those out to records. The problem with those is a couple things. Depending on the size of the business, the RevOps team, who's in charge of carving the territories and whatnot, aren't allowed to do data loads. That usually goes to the business systems teams. Now, when you're smaller, you may have access to that. But like you said, and like Abla said, there's going to be changes throughout the year constantly. Reps are coming and going, account executives, BDRs, overlays, etc. And so that's making you have to get, how did you phrase it, Jason? A constant loop of data loads kind of thing.
Yep.
So what we recommend is instead to try and take a few more steps now in order to make your life easier going forward and for years to come. So you've done the hard work, right? You've created these territories, you've balanced them, you've gone through that negotiation, like Abba said, with the sales leaders. That's the immense amount. Now that you have that, if you've created territory IDs in those spreadsheets or in your planning tool, you can data load those into Salesforce onto all of the account records. And what that does is now allows you to have this unique identifier for each of your territories. And so the step after data loading them in is that you can create territory records in Salesforce. So a new custom object that is one for every one of these unique IDs that you then associate each of those accounts to this territory record. And I think we can all agree that every time you roll out territories, every single rep immediately goes, how can I see all of my accounts? Well, this immediately solves that problem. So yes, you could run a report based on territory ID, but because you now have it in this unique territory record with all the accounts associated, you can now do roll-up scoring. You can see how many accounts are there. What is that score if you've brought that in as well? How has it changed over time? Who are the owners of all of these accounts immediately? So you can see, are there any overlaps? How much change was there from previous years? So to give yourself all of that visibility to start. And Abla, I know you and I have talked about this before, but how does that kind of resonate for you at Alter?
100% rings true for sure. The territory ID, I think, is a crucial piece of this, not only for the initial territory launch at the beginning of every fiscal year, but more importantly for those mid-year changes. When I first started doing this type of work, we didn't assign territory IDs, and we really looked at who's the owner of the account? That's the territory. But when you start having, large movement in headcount, and maybe someone's a temporary owner of an ID of an account, or a manager is owning accounts while they're going to hire a backfill, it starts to get really, really messy. And so having a territory ID that is completely neutral and untethered to a person is really, really helpful, because you can divvy out accounts on a temporary basis while you're looking to fill a territory with a warm body in any variety of ways. And you can, more importantly, pull them back together really, really cleanly too into that territory. And you have visibility, you can see it in reports. It's very easy to keep track of that way. And it's not just who's the owner of the account, that's their territory. It is separate, it's neutral. And that way you can kind of keep track of the performance of a territory, regardless of who owns the accounts within that territory, very cleanly. So highly recommend that as well.
I would imagine, I would imagine, relative to what we were talking about as far as, grading, checking your work, whatever, as far as how you tried to divvy up these territories, this territory ID, this territory object, is critical for being able to do that as well, being able to report and compare, what's happened across those. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I love what you said earlier, Jason, about how, there's a little bit of experimentation every year that you're deciding on these new territories and whatnot. And now you want to go back and check to see how did we do. And so by having put this together, you can go and run those reports to see how did it perform? How did it compare to others? What was the standard deviation from all of the performance? The other equal or even as equitable as you can, these other territories.
Yeah, I think another benefit too is that it makes it very easy for the operations teams to build out account teams easier too, right? So if we're only looking at who owns the account, we need to take into account, well, who's the SDR or BDR on that account? Who's the customer success manager supporting that account? And having it managed through a territory object with the territory ID makes that type of work a lot faster as well. And you can see what's going on in a quick view.
Yeah, no, it's a great segue into how do you enable your entire holistic go-to-market team relative to this. So now we've got it out to them, we've got it rolled out, we've got the data sifted and sorted through. How do you now enable?
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I'd say I'll just add on to what Abba was saying. When we typically think territories, we're thinking the account executive, the seller, but there's obviously a lot more people. There's the BDRs, there's the pre-sales, there's overlays, there's specialists, etc. And so what Abba was saying is create the whole account team. If you have these territory records, you can actually create lookups to each of those people so that now when there's a change, you can just swap the people out. And if you actually go one step further, which is to create assignment rules. So automation that says, hey, when there's a change of ownership, so if I swap out Abla for Jason as the account executive in this territory, your territory assignment rules can then take over to say, we're going to reassign all of the accounts for sure from Abla to Jason, but open opportunities as well, perhaps contacts based on your rules. Probably not leads. Those usually would go to a BDR or whatnot, but same thing, you would set up other rules to say if there's a BDR change or an SDR change, then those leads for the territory are going to get reassigned to this new owner. So you create these assignment rules that don't have to be specific to the territories, just to the relationship in those territory records, to say, based on the owner that's saying defined in this territory record, reassign all of the subsequent records to that person. And that's what I meant before by this can now set you up for success for years, because once that automation is placed, all you have to do is change the owner instead of having to go back to the business systems team to do another data load every single time you change one of those people. And that opens it up to errors too, right? They maybe missed a couple accounts or missed a few opportunities, or they just did accounts, but they didn't tackle contacts as well. So all of that's just going to make your life easier to have it automate and immediately change. And because you have a territory view where you can actually see all of the accounts, you can see owners. And so instantly you can tell this was all handled and done properly. So I don't know if that answered your question, Jason. Were you asking about like execution or now like the actual selling into those territories?
I think the answer is yes to that. And so, I mean, all of the above, and I think they go hand in hand. I mean, how do you drive alignment between those different team members, as well as how do you enable them to go out there and actually effectively execute against those roles? Abla, how are you guys doing that? How are you driving that internally over there?
Yeah, so for us, we go through, or we have all of our account executives and their supporting cast of characters go through an account planning or a territory planning exercise at the beginning of the year. And so we provide them with templates for their territory holistically, and then at the account level as well, where they provide basically their plan of attack for the upcoming period. And so it is a collaborative exercise. They sync with an SDR, they talk to their SEs, they get feedback from their relationships managers who handle our renewals at Alteryx, CSMs. Everyone is responsible for kind of contributing to this account plan document that we then we then post as a living document in Salesforce on the account record, so that there's no question of what the strategy is to go take care of that account in the upcoming fiscal year. It also makes it really easy if we were to have any headcount changes and someone new were to step in and take over the account. They know exactly what is going on. They understand the playbook up front. There's no question. They don't have to start from scratch. Every time an account were to change hands, it's all kind of documented up front. And it's something that they can edit and iterate on through as the year progresses, because plans change. But that is something that we make our reps kind of go through that exercise. We give them time up front at the beginning of the year to make sure that they build those account plans collectively with their account teams, so that everyone knows exactly what the game plan is and they can just hit the ground running.
I love that. Yeah, and I totally agree. I think things like the account plan, the relationship map, who are the people that you're dealing with? Because a lot of times you'll have a ton of contacts on an account in Salesforce, but you'll have pretty much exactly one person on the opportunity. And it's because you converted a lead to an account, an opportunity, or you created a new offer from an account, and it's just that one contact role. And so you can never anticipate when someone's going to come or go as a sales rep. So you never know what knowledge is going to be transferred. What you want to have happen is constantly throughout their day-to-day, they're mapping who the people I'm talking to and who's the champion, but also who's the decision maker, right? Who are those folks that people don't tend to do in Salesforce because it's just that flat list. So you want to use like a relationship map so you can actually get that context and do that handoff. Because like you said, someone leaves, you typically then do a holdover policy to the manager or maybe someone that's affiliated with it, and they need all that context that you might be caught unaware of. And I know last year there was a lot of layoffs and whatnot, so there was a lot of change in ownership that people could have really benefited from having that information at hand.
That's great. I want to make sure we've got plenty of time for Q&A. I know there's quite a few questions that we've not gotten to, but to sort of pull it together, and this may seem like a silly question, but why is this so important? Why do we spend this much time and effort on trying to do this, and why is it so important to get this and do this right? Abla, you want to kick us off there?
Yeah, I think certainly from an operational lens, reassigning territories, assigning territories initially at the beginning of the year, it's a lot of work. It's a really lots of detail, lots of data. And so having a really good game plan and really good operational processes to support this work is only going to help make it faster for you as an operations team. Again, we're normally very understaffed as a practice, I would say, at most companies. And so how do you do things in as scalable as a way as possible? And so really taking the time to kind of follow best practices, do your homework up front, make sure the data is in a really good place is only going to make your lives easier as an operations team to kind of execute those territory changes on an ongoing basis. I really do believe that in revenue operations or in sales operations, if that's kind of where you come from, your job is really to help the company make their number. And not having good processes around territory reassignment are a big problem. That makes it very, very hard to do that job. Territories are how we go to market. It's how we sell. It's the opportunities associated with those accounts. And having that, rolled out cleanly and maintained very efficiently is helping operations team achieve that goal of helping the company hit their numbers. So from my perspective, that's why this is so important. It is core to our mission as revenue and sales operations professionals to help the company achieve their goals.
David?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, when you think about territories at a high level goal, I love what Abla said, that you're trying to reduce the friction. You're trying to allow the business to sell as much as possible. And yet everyone is human. And so if we just said, okay, sales reps, run amok, go for whatever accounts you want, you're going to follow the path of least resistance. You're going to go after the biggest customers first, and everyone's going to start to collide and run into each other. And you're going to cause conflicts and just waste time where you could be spread out attacking other companies individually. And so that exercise then falls on RevOps to say, okay, well, how can we create these even territories that gives everyone an even shot to try and sell as much as they can, because their comp is based on it, right? You're effectively signing a contract with a sales rep to say, we're going to give you this territory and you're going to give us this quota, kind of thing. But now the exercise becomes RevOps problem, where you got to go through this data exercise, and you want to try and do it as evenly as possible, but also, as Abla said, as quickly as possible. And so you're going to put in all the time up front in order to make your life easier later. And so if you can go from the rollout of your territories having assigned automatically, you can save yourself weeks or months of work throughout the course of the year when there's all those changes later. And by making those territories visible to everyone, you can also avoid a lot of the conflict that people tend to run into when they argue that, oh, they didn't realize that wasn't their account, whatnot. That you can shut a lot of that down immediately.
Yeah, and I think that to go back to like policies, like taking the time to write those policies and making sure everyone understands what the rules of the road are, make the jobs of your sales ops support team or your sales ops specialists, who have to kind of live in the weeds with the sales reps, when those friction points come up, they have a really easy way to answer those questions. What is so frustrating, I think, as an operations professional is when you don't know. I don't know what to do here. I'm not sure what the rules are. And the reps also feel frustrated when they don't know what the rules are. So taking the time to make sure that there's really good clarity and alignment around what those rules are going to be. It makes everything just so much less painful for the reps and the operations team to go support them in the way that they need to be supported.
Yeah,
awesome.
Totally. And the faster you can get these reassign when someone leaves, the more likely you are to carry that momentum forward and actually get deals closed, because so much of sales is kind of pushing that boulder up the hill. And as soon as you stop pushing up the hill, it doesn't just stop, it starts rolling backwards. And so you don't want these open ops to sit there unattended. You want to get them out immediately to folks, and not just open ops, but accounts that have activity behind them too. Because you're just, again, trying to create that momentum in these accounts, get them out to somebody, even if it's a manager, but immediately sign. Don't let it just sit there unattended, or worse, have the contacts for reaching out to accounts sit unattended because they're owned by someone who is no longer the business.
Awesome. So we'll go over to Q&A. Anybody that has questions, please put those in the Q&A panel on the right-hand side. Before we get over to those and give everybody an opportunity to do that, I've got one that, has kind of kept coming back to me as we've talked about this. The way that we've talked through this, at least at a high level, might appear to a lot of people like this is primarily applicable to somebody that's doing a sales-led process, probably a more outbound focused, maybe a higher ACV or longer sales cycle type structure. And so if you're somebody doing PLG, or you're doing somebody that has very heavy inbound driven, sales process, stuff like that, what do you say to those that are sitting there going like, maybe this is not that important to us, or not as important?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for PLG is that usually what happens is there's some freemium offering that people sign up for and are using, and at some point they transition over to paying, but that the end game for that business is to try to collect when 5 or 6 people from the same business are using that software, in this case, usually, I think, that they try and turn them into now an enterprise contract or a corporate contract. We've all done it with LinkedIn Sales Navigator, right? Using that individually and then asking to convert over to a pay contract. So all of the same rules apply as soon as you start moving into those upper, larger accounts, still needing to know who owns them, who's going to tackle it, trying to make it equitable, trying to have focus and attention, and to capture the bigger potential there, to use Abla's phrase. That's what I would say. But Abla, how about yourself?
Yeah, I think the best practices that we've outlined would still apply, right? And I think most importantly, though, is that first step that we talked about. What is the strategy, the go-to-market strategy that you're trying to support? So what we have talked about today is, very much named companies, large accounts. We're talking 10, 15, 20, 50 accounts per rep. Like that is all true. But if you have a business where maybe it's all about scale and we don't need that type of, it's not the same model. And we definitely have that at Alteryx, where we have named accounts and then we have an SMB segment where it is a much bigger kind of a scalable or a scale model. Having clarity around what that strategy is, what the motion is, what the sales motion is going to look like in that segment, and then do you have the data to support it, it still applies. It's still the same kind of practice of having clarity around what that is. Do I have the data to be able to support that strategy? And then you go from there. I think too, when you are maybe doing a more transactional type of a sale, or you have territories that are kind of built in that way, Dave kind of hit on it a little bit, but think about automation. Automate as much as you can. Lead follow-up, lead management. What are those opportunities for automation to help support those territories so that you can scale across, thousands of accounts instead of maybe just 10? That would be my recommendation, to kind of get creative around what you can do with automation to support those customers.
No, I think that's great. Those are flavors of the answers that I thought you guys would give, or was hoping that you would give. Part of my motivation in asking it is I've spent most of my career in that other extreme of those types of companies and go-to-market motions and strategies. And I would argue, if anything, it's almost more important to have this stuff nailed down if you're doing that. If you're doing really high volume, high velocity, things that are being thrown at you where you don't have that opportunity to go and pre-plan and pre-assign and all of those things, all the things we've talked about become that much more critical. Making sure that you've got the data sorted out, that you've got these rules for assignment, that you've got the ability to automatically go and distribute them and stuff like that becomes even more important than if you're going through and doing this in a, hey, each rep has 15, 20 named accounts to go after and tackle. And so, that was part of my motivation for it. Is counterintuitively to a lot of people, this is actually arguably even more critical and important if you're doing that, sort of high velocity, high volume type motion for your go-to-market strategy. Cool. So to make sure we get through some of these other ones, how do you handle things like account owner changes, things like that, where you guys talked about, you want to try and limit the amount of change that's going on, the amount of like reassignment, shuffling things around and stuff like that over the course of the year. How do you tackle that? Because obviously it's a fine line, you need to balance it. Do you set caps around it? Do you say, hey, this is set in stone and there's only these caveats for it? Like, how do you walk around or navigate these things that sort of happen in the margin?
So there's a question, Jason, then, like, how do you limit how many times an account gets reassigned through the year because people come and go, or that you have the
specific question was, how do you account for account owner changes? Is there a limit to number of changes in a year? I would say we can extrapolate that out with that being an example of the type of challenge that you might run into. And so philosophically, strategically, how do you approach those types of things?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so a little bit tough based on not knowing exactly what the question was asking, but you certainly don't want to hand accounts off to too many people throughout the year, because you don't get the time frame to create that momentum, right? If you're constantly switching, not only is it a really poor customer experience, but you just don't get the time and attention you need to get something moving based on your average deal length. But if the question is more around how do you stop from reassigning it, I mean, one best practice is that if someone leaves the business, like Avla said, assign it to the manager in the meantime. And that at least gives one consistent point of contact for the customer, who then will be backfilled later, but the manager can still remain involved. Hopefully that answers the question. I don't know exactly what was being asked. But
I would have answered it exactly the same way, Dave. I think just thinking of it from a customer's perspective, and we're all customers of as well, like having to deal with churn in terms of who is managing my account is a really poor experience, and you want to eliminate or reduce the breakage in that relationship as much as possible. So I would say a guiding principle from a sales, from an operations side of the house, is to try and limit movement as much as possible. I would say intra-year and year over year. That's something I think that we haven't talked about, but that is an important factor to take into consideration when you're looking at territories for the year over year cutovers. Of how do I eliminate breakage as much as possible so that we can keep that relationship kind of continuous and smooth and the customer happy. So I would say best practice is to try and limit it as much as possible. In my experience, we've taken a pretty hard line and said no changes. Territories are built with your managers. They have blessed these territories for the upcoming year, and they're done. We give them a short dispute window at the beginning of the year to kind of do some cleanup where maybe a hierarchy is structured incorrectly and a subsidiary is sitting with the wrong rep. And we give that kind of leeway, that we have a pretty hard line that the territories are the territories. Go sell, please stop fighting over accounts. That's a pretty hard line. We haven't always been that strict. I've seen it work okay, where maybe two reps under the same manager can kind of work together to do a swap. But again, I think a guiding principle to anchor to is to not do that as much as possible. And it's really just because the customer experience is really poor. We don't want to break those relationships as much as possible.
Cool. All right, we are out of time. Adam, we did not get to your technical question about other objects in Salesforce. I will make sure that David or somebody from Traction Complete reaches out to you directly to answer that question so that we don't leave you hanging there. But like I said, we're out of time on this front. Abla, David, this has been fantastic. This has been a great conversation on a topic that's incredibly important.
Yeah, Jason, thanks so much for having us. Like you said, we'll send out this guide. I know we rushed through it really quickly, but a more in-depth guide on how to do territory reassignment and whatnot. And we'd love to help. So if you'd like to learn more, come check us out at tractioncomplete.com or the Revenue Optimist, which is kind of another community for RevOps folks to learn from one another.
Awesome. Abla, thank you so much. David.
Thanks, Jason. It's been awesome. Really appreciate the time.
All right, great. Thanks, everybody.